Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Places, People, Purpose. We're going to go on a fascinating journey in time and look at some really interesting stories leading up to the construction of the Panama Canal, including events that most people aren't aware of. In today's podcast, we'll focus on the reasons that led to the initial efforts to build the canal, the importance of the Panama Railroad, and the first attempt to build the canal by the French. On January 24th of 1848, James Marshall, who was a carpenter working for John Sutter, found flakes of gold in a stream bed near Sacramento, California. News of the discovery spread quickly, and the area became besieged by thousands of gold prospectors. By 1853, the number of people who had moved to California to seek their fortune had grown to 250,000. From the East Coast, there were three ways to get to California. Prospectors could sail around Cape Horn, hike across the Isthmus of Panama, or take a 2,000-mile or 3,200-kilometer overland route. A journey from New York to San Francisco around South America took about a month and was 13,000 miles in length. Conversely, New York to California via Panama was 5,000 miles. The idea of constructing a railway across the narrow Isthmus of Panama was born out of the need to provide a quicker and safer route for travelers and goods moving between the east and west coasts of the United States. The treacherous journey around Cape Horn or through the often perilous overland routes prompted the necessity for a more efficient alternative. American entrepreneur and engineer William Henry Aspinwall, along with his partners, recognized the potential of building a railroad connecting the Atlantic port of Colón to the Pacific port of Panama City. The Panama Railway Company was formed in 1849, and construction commenced in earnest in 1850. The railroad was supposed to be completed in 2 years, but the challenges faced by engineers during the construction were immense, including dense jungles, swamps, and steep terrain. Largely due to these obstacles, the completion of the railway required 5 years at a cost of $8 million, which was 6 times the original estimate. Perhaps this should have been a sign to the eventual canal builders about realistic timelines and budget targets when it came to building infrastructure projects in Panama. The railway's role as a link between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans led to a surge in trade and the exchange of goods, benefiting industries ranging from agriculture to manufacturing. The new route was particularly beneficial for the California gold rush, providing a swift means of transporting gold seekers and their fortunes. The completion of the Panama Railway marked a turning point in global trade dynamics. It was the first transcontinental railroad in the world, and it was the most expensive railroad to travel on. The cost of a one-way ticket to travel approximately 48 miles was $25 in gold. Because it had a monopoly on Panama transit, the railroad was extremely profitable. Its stock hit $295, which made it the highest priced stock on the New York Exchange at that time. As we will see, the Panama Railroad actually played a significant role in the construction of the canal. Beyond its economic impact, the Panama Railway also wielded geopolitical significance. The United States, recognizing the strategic value of a transcontinental transportation route, maintained a vested interest in the railway's operations. The railway's presence and the United States' influence in the region ultimately paved the way for their involvement in the construction of the Panama Canal decades later. As we mentioned earlier, the first attempt at building the canal was by the French. The driving force behind the French attempt to construct the Panama Canal was the charismatic and determined Ferdinand de Lesseps. Having successfully overseen the construction of the Suez Canal in Egypt, de Lesseps believed that a similar feat could be achieved in Panama. The idea was to create a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, thereby revolutionizing global trade routes and greatly reducing travel times for ships. De Lesseps' confidence and belief in a sea-level canal across the Panama Isthmus drove the initial planning and execution. However, the success in Egypt could not be replicated seamlessly in the challenging terrain of Panama. Shortly after beginning the construction of the canal, the company formed by de Lesseps to build the canal, the Universal Panama Interoceanic Canal Company, paid over $20 million to purchase the stock of the railroad so that the railroad could be used in conjunction with the canal project. This equaled a share price of $292 and was more than a third of the company's resources. Even with the purchase, the railroad's right of transit emanated from a treaty between the U.S. and Colombia, which indicated that the U.S. had a continuing obligation to guarantee uninterrupted traffic on the line, as well as Colombian sovereignty on the isthmus. So an American military presence in both Colón and Panama City to protect the railroad continued. The original plan de Lesseps had for the canal was that it would be completed in 12 years, which would be 1892, for a total cost of slightly less than $132 million. This amount was almost triple the cost of the Suez Canal. De Lesseps and his associates formed the Canal Company in 1881, securing the rights to build and operate the canal in Panama. However, the challenges that lay ahead would prove to be far greater than those encountered in Egypt during the Suez Canal project. On February 1, 1881, the French began work on the Panama Canal. Perhaps not fully appreciated by the French was the fact that the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans have different sea levels and different levels of high tide. At the entrance to the Panama Canal, the Pacific Ocean can rise as much as 20 feet, but 45 miles away, the difference between high tide and low in the Atlantic is just 3 feet. This, plus other miscalculations, made the probability of success by the French remote. Unfortunately, the French underestimated the engineering challenges posed by the Panama Isthmus, and this made any meaningful progress difficult to come by. The attempt to create a sea-level canal encountered unforeseen complexities, including dense jungles, steep mountains, and unpredictable weather patterns. Engineers faced the colossal task of cutting through mountains, dealing with landslides, and managing the vast quantities of excavated material. An area known as the Culebra Cut was one of the most difficult challenges. Each year, hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of mud and rock slid down into the open cut, ruining months of work. Removing the mud and debris was just part of the issue. To prevent further slides from taking place, the engineers tried to make the slope of the walls less steep so that the material would remain in place. But it was never enough, and each widening of the Culebra Cut to reduce the slope of the hillside meant that the volume of the required excavation was being compounded steadily and enormously. The construction of the Panama Canal was not just a monumental engineering challenge, it was also an immense financial endeavor. Financial instability and mismanagement plagued the French effort from its inception. The French Canal Company struggled to secure sufficient funding, leading to cost-cutting measures that compromised the quality of the project. Furthermore, allegations of corruption and bribery tainted the venture, diverting resources and exacerbating financial troubles. The lack of transparency and accountability in financial matters accelerated the project's downward spiral. In July of 1885, at the annual stockholders' meeting, de Lesseps claimed that the efforts put forth may be considered as more than half the total efforts necessary. This statement was, of course, not true, and an American officer familiar with the project estimated that only about a tenth of the canal had been completed. We will stop here for today's episode. As you can tell, much intrigue and suspense has yet to play out in the attempt by the French to build the canal. Please join us for tomorrow's episode when we will continue with this fascinating story and learn how the French effort ultimately ended and what happened next. Until then, thank you for joining Places, People, Purpose, where we create connections to our world.